Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Military Forces Unleashed. Today we're diving into one of the most talked about military forces on the planet, the Russian military. Modernized, rearmed, and revitalized. Well, sort of. You know how Russia loves to flex, right? But behind all that muscle, there's a lot more going on. We're going to break it all down today, what's working, what's definitely not, and where things are headed. So hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and buckle up, because this one's packed with facts, a bit of humor, and maybe a few moments that'll make you say, wait, they did what? Let's get started. Russia's military forces have always been surrounded by an aura of mystique, with their Soviet-era Red Army considered one of the most formidable fighting machines in history. But by the late 1990s, that shadow had faded. Picture this: the once proud military, known for its enormous Cold War arsenal, was in disarray, as if the Kremlin had spent the last decade too hungover to notice the rust forming on its tanks and jets. Troops were underpaid, equipment was obsolete, and morale had plummeted. Russian soldiers looked more like they'd been thrown into a game of survival than professional military operations. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia inherited a military that was a bloated, decaying relic of its former self. What followed was nearly 2 decades of neglect, stagnation, and failed reforms. But in the late 2000s, things began to change. Moscow decided it was time to get serious. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, didn't just want to be feared, it wanted to be respected. So they embarked on a mission: modernization, rearmament, and revitalization of their military forces. Spoiler alert, this didn't come without its fair share of hiccups. But hey, that's Russia for you. You can't just slap a fresh coat of paint on a tank and call it modern. Russia had a mountain of problems to climb before their military could be called modernized. Let's start with the basics. Corruption. It's an unavoidable Russian pastime, right up there with vodka and questionable geopolitics. Corruption plagued every level of their defense industry, from skimming funds on military contracts to the classic buying subpar materials for full price. It was clear that much of Russia's defense budget was disappearing into the pockets of officials instead of being used to buy, functioning weapons. Next, the equipment. By the time Russia entered the 21st century, much of its Soviet-era machinery was so outdated that it was practically ready for a museum exhibit. Tanks like the T-72, sure, they were a beast in their prime 30 years ago. Their jet fighters, like the MiG-29 and Su-27, were legends of the Cold War, but the new millennium needed something more than an aging MiG still trying to squeeze out another dogfight, like an overworked Lada sputtering on its last tank of gas. And then there were the troops. Russian conscripts weren't exactly the poster children of military efficiency. They were undertrained, poorly equipped, and sometimes unpaid. Desertion rates soared, and in some cases, soldiers were more concerned with staying warm and fed than actually fighting. The military's human resources needed just as much modernization as its equipment. How do you revamp an entire military structure plagued by corruption, outdated equipment, and low morale? Well, first, you throw money at it. Then you make a big deal about it. Putin's Russia embarked on the state armament program, injecting billions of rubles into the defense budget. Between 2011 and 2020, Russia planned to spend the equivalent of over $700 billion to modernize its military hardware and reform its structure. The primary goal? By 2020, 70% of the military's equipment should be modern. Enter new toys: the T-14 Armata tank, Su-57 stealth fighter, S-400 missile defense systems. Big, flashy weapons designed to make NATO lose sleep. Russia also went through a restructuring process, improving its command and control systems and reducing its bloated officer corps. Essentially, they tried to trim the fat while beefing up their high-tech capabilities. They even upped their game in hybrid warfare, leveraging cyber tactics and information warfare. But let's not get carried away. As with any massive overhaul, there were some glaring issues. For one, those shiny new tanks and jets. Yeah, the development process wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Take the T-14 Armata, for instance. Sure, it's a cutting-edge tank, but when the world saw it during the 2015 Victory Day parade, it infamously stalled right in the middle of Red Square. Awkward. And the Su-57? It was meant to be Russia's answer to America's F-35, except they struggled to get it off the production line. Literally. Russia was barely able to produce a handful of them by the 2020 target. So, how do you test whether your modernized military can actually perform? You go to war. Enter Syria, 2015. Russia, keen on showing off its new capabilities, launched a military intervention in support of Bashar al-Assad's regime. This was the perfect opportunity to test their new equipment and tactics under real combat conditions. It was also a geopolitical statement. Russia was back in the game, and it wanted everyone to know it. The Russian Air Force, bolstered by Su-34s and Su-35s, conducted precision airstrikes, something that would have been laughable a few years prior when they barely had functioning jets. The Kalibr cruise missile was launched from ships in the Caspian Sea, hitting targets over 1,000 kilometers away in Syria. Again, a far cry from the days when Russian equipment was better suited for a scrapyard than a battlefield. But not everything went according to plan. Civilian casualties from Russian strikes drew global condemnation, and there were reports of malfunctioning equipment. The modernized Russian military had yet to shake off all the rust, but it did manage to remind the world that it wasn't just a regional power, it still had global reach. So what did we learn from Russia's military modernization? First, that throwing money at a problem can sometimes work, but only if you keep a tight leash on the corruption. Russia has managed to turn its military from a decaying relic into a somewhat competent fighting force, but it's far from perfect. The modernization process was marred by delays, cost overruns, and quality control issues. Second, we learned that Russia excels in adaptability. The intervention in Syria demonstrated that, despite these setbacks, Russia's military is flexible enough to operate effectively in modern conflicts. They've also embraced the future of warfare, integrating cyber and information warfare into their doctrine. But we also learned that Russia's modernization is still very much a work in progress. Those shiny new tanks and jets, there aren't nearly enough of them to make a significant impact in a full-scale war. And despite improvements in professionalism, their conscript-heavy forces still suffer from low morale and questionable leadership at times. In the grand scheme of things, Russia's military modernization has been both impressive and deeply flawed. On one hand, they've clawed their way back from the brink of irrelevance, reminding the world that they're still a force to be reckoned with. On the other, they've struggled with corruption, inefficiency, and the realities of trying to modernize a force built on Soviet-era doctrines. The Russian military isn't quite the juggernaut it wants to be, but it's certainly a far cry from the shambles it was in the 1990s. Whether this revitalized force can sustain itself or crumble under its own bureaucratic weight remains to be seen. Alright folks, that's a wrap on today's episode. The Russian military, modernized, but still a bit of a mixed bag, huh? They've come a long way from those post-Soviet days of rusted tanks and unpaid soldiers, but they're not quite the unstoppable force they'd like us to believe. What do you think? Will they keep pushing forward, or are they going to hit a wall with all the corruption and inefficiencies? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you're not part of the Military Forces Unleashed family yet. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay informed.